Hello there, my little freaks and creeps. We're headed back to the prison yard today, but don't worry, we're not going to be there too long because we're talking prison breaks. Now, there'll be very few references to Wentworth Miller or the 2005 prestige drama. Actually, I can't promise that. But what I can promise is that this video will feature some of the scariest prison breaks in history. This is top 5 scary prison breaks that could happen again. Let me know down below in the comments which of these prison breaks interested you the most. Let's get to it. Number 5. John Dillinger. John Dillinger is one of America's most prolific bank robbers. Hearing his name calls to mind fast-paced car chases, slick fedoras, revolvers, and banknotes. And for good reason. Dillinger managed to hit 24 banks in his lifetime. And I couldn't find any information on whether or not this is true. I'm pretty sure he holds the world record for most banks robbed. I have a strong feeling that he does. He was imprisoned multiple times over his crime career, but you couldn't keep a good career criminal like this down because he escaped prison multiple times. Now, the first time, Dillinger's gang disguised themselves as police officers, but his most famous escape was during 1934. After robbing the East Chicago First National Bank, Dillinger fired at a police officer, sealing his fate and landing him with some pretty serious charges, as up until then he was only charged with robberies. After the heist, a fire broke out at a hotel the gang was laying low at, leading to a tip that led authorities to Dillinger, who shipped him away to Crown Point, Indiana, and treated him as one of their most dangerous prisoners. All of them expecting him to try and escape again. And they were right to think that, because he did. Dillinger was surrounded by 6 guards at all times, armed and ready. But despite this, and the little free time he had, Dillinger was still able to carve a fake pistol out of an old piece of washboard using razor blades. Dillinger used his homemade wooden pistol to threaten the guards at, well, not quite gunpoint, but wood point, I guess, and forced them to free him and lead him out of jail. Dillinger jacked a car from a nearby alleyway, and with hostages under his wing, Dillinger had escaped again. This would lead to Edgar Hoover tightening up an FBI task force just to hunt down John Dillinger, placing a $10,000 bounty on his head. This led to an accomplice of Dillinger ratting him out, leading to his fatal final encounter with the police in an alleyway outside a Chicago movie theater, ending the legendary gangster's crime spree. Want to hear more about weird crimes? Subscribe to Top 5 Scary for way more every day. Let's keep going. Number 4. The Texas 7. The Texas 7 refers to a gang of 7 highly dangerous inmates who ganged together in 2000 to hatch an escape plan from John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security state prison in South Texas. The group comprised all kinds of nasty criminals, some on death row. Some of them were even serving 99-year sentences. All of them were serving long sentences with no chance of parole. And as such, they looked for other options to regain their freedom. Now, what they had was strength in numbers. On December 13, 2000, the group launched their plan into action. They'd waited for the slowest part of the day when guard patrols were at their most thin, and plain and simple, started knocking officers out. They would have one member of the 7 beckon an officer over and another restraining and knocking him unconscious from behind. From here, they kept taking pages out of Agent 47's notebook and hid the officers' bodies, tied them up, and placed in a locked door, and stole their uniforms, credit cards, and ID from the victims. They then posed as police to ward off suspicion. From here, 3 of the men made their way to the back of the prison, changed into civilian disguises, and posed as a surveillance camera crew to install new monitors. They knocked out another guard and raided the guard tower and stole numerous weapons to take with them. The 4 who'd stayed behind stole a prison maintenance truck, picked up their co-conspirators, and fled the scene. Their newfound freedom barely lasted though, as the men had left a trail of evidence and were on the FBI's most wanted. Not helping matters was that mere days after the escape, they robbed a store, which eventually led to the death of an officer, leading to a $500,000 bounty for the capture of the Texas 7. A year later, after several tips, the FBI apprehended what members were still living who had scattered across the country. Those they found are back in prisons, unlikely to ever pull something like that off again. Number 3. El Chapo. El Chapo, otherwise known as Joaquin Guzman, is one of the most notorious drug lords to ever live. He founded the Sinaloa cartel in the 80s and dominated the trade. Over his long career, he was captured and arrested several times, but made a prolific habit of his escapes. His first arrest was in 1993, and it didn't stop him from running operations at all out of the minimum security prison, but it wouldn't always be this easy. In 2001, the cartel bribed the guards, who loaded Guzman into a laundry cart and simply wheeled him out of the prison like it was nothing. The next 14 years would see Guzman continuing out operations as normal, undeterred by his short time in the clink. He was incarcerated again in 2014, and this time the escape was a lot more elaborate, and he had a lot more help. In Altiplano Federal Prison, Guzman disappeared entirely in July, and authorities were stunned to discover that the cartel had been digging a tunnel for months, that led directly from a small 2-foot hole in the showers. The tunnel spanned nearly a mile and was fitted with lights, ventilation, and most amazingly, had a motorcycle all ready to go for Guzman to ride to freedom, all the way to a cinder block house that had been constructed at the end of it. He would manage to elude capture again, for a bit at least, until 2016, where he would face extradition. He's currently incarcerated again, and knowing his reputation, who knows if he'll stay there. Number 2. Richard Lee Mcnair. Richard Lee Mcnair's story is perhaps one of the most wild prison break stories I had ever read. It's probably the most wild one on this list, to be honest. Mcnair was raised by a police officer, but would find himself straying from the law when in 1987 he robbed a grain storage facility in North Dakota, where he fatally shot at a man and wounded another. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and a burglary charge on top of that. Unhappy with his new surroundings, Mcnair would sneak through a ventilation pipe in North Dakota State Pen in 1993, although he was swiftly recaptured. Now, one escape from prison is already pretty cool, but it was his second escaped attempt that was infinitely more impressive. Mcnair was eventually transferred to a federal prison in Pollock, Louisiana. Mcnair was assigned to the work detail in the manufacturing room, where he would repair broken items, including patching up old mail bags, which inspired him to hatch an ingenious plan. In secret, Mcnair built himself what he called his escape pod, a small compartment with a breathing tube he would hide inside. Now, he hid himself inside the mailbag pile, shrink wrapped and forklifted to a nearby warehouse outside of the prison. He mailed himself out of jail. He says the heat was unimaginable, that it felt like being inside a furnace, and that he was afraid he was going to pass out. When the warehouse staff broke for lunch, Mcnair cut himself free and fled the prison as fast as he could. He was apprehended by a local police officer, but managed to convince the cop that he was just a local jogger and not that escaped convict everybody's looking for. Mcnair fled to Canada, living across British Columbia, Ontario, and eventually settling in New Brunswick. Having successfully escaped the long arm of the law and living on the lam, fighting the law and winning. Take that, The Clash. Well, for about a year, at least. Despite managing his impressive escape, he was widely known, featuring on America's Most Wanted, and had to live a pretty quiet lifestyle. He was cited in Canada multiple times. Eventually, he would end up being busted for driving a stolen white van in 2007, describing his capture as just being bad luck. Just one of those days, Mcnair said. After a year on the lam, Mcnair was returned to the States, where he is now interred in a supermax prison deemed for prisoners where maximum security isn't enough. But I'm sure he's plotting a way to get out of this one. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz was built to wear down the hopes of the most rebellious prisoners. The infamous San Fran Island was known as the Rock for how heavily guarded and seemingly inescapable it was. Of course, if you know about the movie Escape from Alcatraz, then you already know in 1962, 3 daredevil convicts did the impossible and managed to escape the unescapable. Between 1934 and 1962, there were 13 failed escape attempts. But I guess if anything, that just served as inspiration for inmates Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, who would prove everyone wrong. They had planned this for months. Frank Morris brought in his accomplices John and Clarence, and their 4th accomplice, Alan West, who had all met each other from previous incarcerations and had a pretty good thing going. During the days, they stole spoons and discarded saw blades from the workyard, and spent upwards of 7 months widening the ventilation ducts in each of their cells, with Frank Morris loudly playing the accordion to conceal their handiwork. That's hilarious, by the way. Whenever they weren't working on it, they covered the holes with gray painted cardboard. The ducts would lead to a tunnel where the 4 men had stored a 6 by 14 foot raft that the men had made out of discarded raincoats, held together with soap and sealed with heat from the steam pipes. These guys were unbelievably crafty, because check this out too. They assembled dummy heads out of paper mache, hair from the barbers, and painted them as realistically as they possibly could. They stuffed laundry and discarded rags under their blankets with their paper heads poking out while they escaped so it looked like they were sleeping. That is hilarious. That's like Ferris Bueller stuff. Unfortunately, on the night of the escape, Alan West was left behind when he couldn't get the grill of his duct off. The other men, however, weren't willing to wait around, grabbed the raft, slid down to the roof, and snuck to the shore. Now, what happened next is lost to time. The prevailing theory is that the men drowned in the harsh waters on the way out, although the Anglin family claims that the men had escaped. Regardless of the truth, the men did the impossible. That's all for this video, my ghouls and goblins. Creep on creeping on, and I'll see you in the next one.